All right, so we're going to talk to Rob from Ohio, who says, I have a syllogism that show that apologetics can be used for anything, including refuting the Bible itself. Rob, talk us through it.
Hi, that's wonderful. Good to talk to you guys. Thank you so much.
No problem. Let's hear this syllogism.
Simply, there are two presuppositions. The first is that the Bible or God obviously exists, and two is that the Bible is actually flawed. The flaws that are laid out in the Bible are accurately depicted. Whether God did the actual bad things that we agree in hindsight were bad, or if that's just the way the book presents them, is open to debate. But God did those things so that humans would grow beyond the need for God, because there are so many kinds of gods. We must eventually collaborate to agree on moral stances and laws and regulations to bind all of us to eventually supersede the need for God itself, because God, wanting to have us free will, needs to move away from us entirely.
So how would you present that as a syllogism, man? Because the screening notes said you had a syllogism. So how would you present it in a point-by-point argument?
God must exist, and God, wanting us to have free will, would at some point need to take the reins off of humanity. How would God do such? By making a moral being who is flawed, thereby instantiating that humans must use human power and human communication to create a better moral philosophy than the one God laid down.
Jamie?
I've got a couple of questions. Firstly,
Sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong. We know God's moral standards or his rules for us. If he, again, accepting your two premises of God's real and the Bible's accurate, through the Bible. So, but in the Bible, there are instances of him obviously not encouraging human communication and human interaction, like the Tower of Babel, like splitting us apart on purpose. So your syllogism doesn't seem to cover the part where we therefore ignore the Bible, because everything that's written in there doesn't, it instructs us to obey. It wants us to have a relationship with God and love him and not go past him, but go to him. How do you square that?
If we are to love God, we must understand God. And if God is ununderstandable, perhaps God doesn't want us to understand him, and then we must therefore communicate with each other beings we do understand. Looking at the Bible logically, where things seem to conflict, where God's will seems to be mercurial, then we must question, how do we love God properly? And if we can't come to a conclusion that on God, perhaps we can come to a conclusion that collectively.
Some people I would imagine, argue that you're an atheist, are you not?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure we knew where you were coming from. Because I'm going to steal man kind of theists here. I'm going to pretend I'm a theist and
sure.
kind of arguing against that. So how would you demonstrate that the instructions are contradictions and not just the flaws of, let's say that the Bible's, because in my school of theism, the particular one that I practice, God inspired the Bible. He didn't write it. And through this inspiration, men sometimes got things wrong. So that's where the contradictions come in the Bible. So how would you square that?
Well, of course, but those contradictions do then require further investigation. God is, in the Bible, a perfectly moral being. So if we do run into issues in the Bible where there are clearly immoral or amoral dealings in hindsight, because God is supposed to be a perfectly moral being, his will is law and forever moral. If something is immoral in hindsight, then it must have been a human flaw, which is understandable. But if God can't use us perfectly, shouldn't we engage with each other as imperfect interlocutors for God?
How do we demonstrate in the Bible that God is a perfect moral being, that's what's claimed in the Bible? Where in the Bible would would you point to either God's instructions or God's actions which demonstrate him to be a perfectly moral being?
Oh, that's a fair point. I don't know that there's anywhere in the Bible that actually claims that God is himself perfect, because God does in various places also say, I am a jealous God, and well, I think jealousy is an imperfect construct that only humans would necessarily have, or other maybe biological beings.
So couldn't we say then that it's in fact it's human flaws that lead us to believe that there's contradictions rather than there being contradictions themselves? God wanted us to purposefully gave us our own free will, our own choice to write this stuff down, and to misinterpreting that is all part of the test that God gave us.
I think that would be a point in my favor, in which that God does want us to have our own free will, absent of him, although he does want the terminating point to be worship, it appears to be. But the fact that God does give us the free will to be wrong occasionally does seem to lean the point that, well, then we must have to be able to correct ourselves.
Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to jump in on. I'm sorry to jump in, but there's something scratching at my head. Firstly, no theist, apart from maybe Calvinists, most of them believe in free will and see that as a justification for God's immorality. Like, God only does immoral things from our perspective because we have free will and we are displeasing him. And I'm kind of trying to think about why you would want to come with a syllogism that predicates that both God is real and the Bible is accurate, to try and say, and even given those facts, I can argue that we should move past God, that you should no longer, and that's his plan. Because I think any theist that you've tried that on would go, "Oh, God's real and the Bible's accurate. Thanks, bye," and would just completely.
I said the Bible is inaccurate.
Well, the Bible is flawed, but you're saying that all the flaws there are an accurate depiction of what's happened, like his immorality, the depictions of God's immorality, like the genocides, the flood, and all that, are accurate depictions of his potential immorality. But unless I'm misunderstanding your second premise of your syllogism.
Maybe slightly. The elements of God, since we can't be entirely certain, and because scientifically it doesn't seem like a lot of these things, like the flood and other various biblical elements, are not possible. God would have to be a being that can cause impossible things to happen. And since we don't seem to have that bearing out in other places, then we do need to kind of come to a consensus on what is happening, what can happen. So God either wanted those bad stories included because he did them for whatever reasons God may have, or the flaws are in the Bible are there by design to make you question God.
I mean,
what? Go on, Jamie.
It doesn't seem to make, especially that in my mind, comes up against the omniscient and omnipotent parts of the triomny, which is one of the big problems, because it's like, why would God want us to not like him and exercise our free will and purposefully make himself look bad if he wasn't? It just doesn't seem to make sense. That's a very irrational thing. And then we're just straying into the things of like, oh, God's infinite wisdom, mysterious ways, that kind of thing. And I can't get on board with that, I'm afraid, because I'm like, if I were God, or if any sensible creature were creating a race and wanted to eventually have a willingful relationship, like, he's doing all this so we willingly come to him in the end through our own free will, and it's all consensual and lovely. I wouldn't paint myself as a monstrous murder bastard, but that's just me.
The thing is with this, you kind of The notes on the call say you have a syllogism that shows that apologetics can be used for anything, including refuting the Bible itself. But why would you go to the... I don't understand what the point is of going to the lengths of kind of creating a syllogism for something that you don't really need to create a syllogism for. A syllogism is primarily for coming up with kind of deductive proof of something. But we've got plenty of kind of inference from things like archaeology and just the historical evidence of how the Bible was written, how it was put together, how the things like theology were decided at the councils of Nicaea, and all that kind of stuff. There's so much evidence out there that to kind of like dismiss it out of hand, if you like, to begin with, that it kind of seems a little bit like mental masturbation, going through the process of creating a syllogism to kind of disprove it when we don't really have to do that. And I'm just kind of interested in what your thought processes were behind that. And I'm sorry if I sound like I'm beating up on you. I'm really, really not. I'm just interested in kind of what led you to do this.
So the thought process I was coming from was that apologetics will, at a certain point, have to terminate in, well, God. Well, God did those things because God did those things. And it's a self-sealing circular kind of labyrinth. And if we use a syllogism that presupposes God and comes to the conclusion that perhaps God made the Bible flawed so that it shows that the line of thinking itself is actually a problem, not in any of the elements themselves of the problem, that the apologetics itself as a theorem is incorrect.
But this is one of the problems that we're having with a syllogism, is that for a logical syllogism to be both valid and sound, the premises have to be logical. They have to make sense and be true. So when you presuppose that God is real, you've already lost, because you've said your God's real. And for this syllogism to work, we have to accept that. Like, no, you can't disprove God by saying he's real, or disprove religion by saying God's real. You've already conceded the main point. So I don't know. It doesn't make much sense to me, Rob. I'm sorry. My head's okay. half cotton wool anyway, so maybe I'm just not getting the point.
I may not be presenting it in the best way, so that may be on me. But the overall point would be that from a theistic standpoint, their immediate starting point is God is correct, and if we take that presupposition, I can use that presupposition that they would like to use and argue for why God might want us to actually move away from God. If God wants us to have free will, and it at least seems that way, although free will is an entirely philosophical concept, then what would be the most free will? Know God. And how could we come to know God? By having a flawed God, and all these gods don't make sense. And, well, what if we just work together as humans and try to come up with a system that we all like? If God being not a monster, we don't necessarily need maybe the God worship part just to be good people in order to get into some afterlife, supposedly. This would be specifically for like Christian apologetics. I couldn't argue on behalf of other religions.
Still seems like a paradox to me. God is real, therefore God is not real. It just does not. Eventually we'll get to God. God isn't real.
Yeah, I think
it's not so much the real factor. It's more whether God is real or is not is actually not the real question.
But that's not how you've structured your syllogism, and that's the point. You said, you started with your first premise, if God is real. Now, in the syllogistic argument, when you're saying if, what you're saying is if and only if. It's a statement of fact, if you like. So you are kind of proposing that God is real in your first thing. In your first premise, and then you're saying, God is real, but then again, look at all this stuff which disproves God, and it doesn't really follow on. So I think these I'm saying I'm not beating up on you, and it might sound like I am, but these things are
really. I can be corrected and be wrong.
these things are really good to think about. And if you're forming a syllogistic argument, I think the first thing that you kind of that I would suggest that you do is, because when I asked you what your actual premises were, you kind of went off on this kind of rambling thing about these different things. Get short, snappy premises which really lay out your argument, and kind of do that. I'd be interested if in a few weeks, I think me and Jamie are on the first show after Christmas, and over the Christmas period, have a think about how you would actually form this into, look at some syllogistic arguments, and look how you would form like really bullet point type arguments for each point of this argument of the syllogism, and kind of come back to us and kind of represent it to us, and kind of see, have a think about it and see how you've done.
We'll call into one of the shows with J Mike on. He's the logic man. Like he will school you on logic if you want to know logic. So yeah, but yeah, we'd like to hear from you again, Rob.
That would be great.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. You guys do great work. It's gonna be fun to listen into the live show on the other end.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and have a good Christmas as well. A good holiday season, no matter what you're doing.